Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to Mormon Mental Health. This is Natasha Helfer-Parker. I'm excited to have another episode tonight where I have more leaders from Affirmation. This time in English, so last time was in Spanish. Excited to have Nathan Kitchen and Laurie Lee Hall. Nathan's the president and Laurie Lee is the senior vice president of Affirmation on the show tonight to talk about the impacts of the reversal of what's typically called the exclusion policy that affected LGBTQ plus families and members in the Mormon Church. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. Before I introduce them, I just want to give a little plug for Mormon Mental Health Podcast. So as you're probably aware from hearing me in the past, unless this is your first time hearing me, this podcast is completely dependent on listener donations, and you can very easily make a donation to the Mormon Mental Health Podcast at mormonmentalhealth.org. So I can't continue this being a financially sustainable podcast if I don't get people who value it to donate. So please consider that. And for all of those who already do that, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I love this little job I've given myself, and I think it's a helpful resource. I get a lot of positive feedback about it, and I'd like for it to continue. As far as getting in touch with me or interested in anything else that I'm a part of, you can always go to my personal website, which is natashaparker.org. And there you can see either other projects I work on, other maybe presentations I might be giving in your area, and or if you want to see me or one of my providers professionally, that's kind of how you get in touch with us. So without further ado, let me bring on our guests. So Nathan, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself first. And I guess in the introduction, what I'm looking for is just kind of who you are, maybe what your relationship with the church is, and kind of your role and how you got involved with Affirmation. And then we'll let Laurie Lee go.
Excellent. Thank you. I have 5 children, and I am a dentist in Mesa, Arizona. And I was married for 23 years, now divorced, and I am engaged to be married to my fiancé, Matt, in November.
Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you. You know, how I found Affirmation is I initially was looking for support back in 2009 when I was starting to question what was happening in my life and why can't I hold this together? What's wrong with me? Thinking there was something wrong with me. And everywhere I looked at that time, there wasn't the support that I needed to help me through that transition. And so I just did it myself. Figured things out, brought family and extended family with me on this journey, and ended up in 2014, a divorced single man with 5 kids, just sitting in a house by myself, like, what do I do now? And I found a support community in Affirmation, and I went to the very first retreat they had in Palmyra in 2015, and was blown away at this wonderful community that had been built since I first looked for one in 2009. I met so many excellent people. And from there, I began a father's group in Affirmation, and have just been in love with the support that Affirmation can offer LGBTQ members and those who are not of the faith. So that's my story.
Okay, thank you so much. Laurie Lee.
So I'm Laurie Lee Hall, and I serve on Affirmation's board as the Senior Vice President. I joined Affirmations board in October of 2017. My experience with the church is deep and extensive, and people always like to hear just a skosh about that. That I served in my prior life as an LDS bishop and stake president until the brethren found that I was transgender, and that ended that. And I served as a church employee as well as a senior architect, chief architect for the church over temples and other special projects. And that continued until the time where I needed to live authentically full-time as myself. And so that came to an end. And so now I have a private practice in architecture, and I have office in Salt Lake City as well as in Louisville, Kentucky, where I now reside. I'm the parent of 5 children and grandparent of soon to be 12 grandchildren. And my experience coming to tonight's topic will be a little bit different point of view, that of a person with transgender history. But also one deeply interested in all aspects of our LGBTQ community. My path to affirmation was different from Nathan's. I had already found my way in terms of my transition, and I was full-time before I met affirmation. I actually went through my excommunication from the church because of my transition, and then received a phone call from the executive director of Affirmation, who wanted to call and see if I was doing okay. And I hadn't met him before, and we talked, and he wanted to make sure I had made it through the church disciplinary council, if my feelings and testimony and faith were okay. And as we talked, he said, "Can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, "Would you speak at our conference next month?" And so I spoke at the international conference in August of 2017 to Affirmation. I actually had to join Affirmation in order to come to the conference and be able to be a presenter. And shortly thereafter was asked to serve on the board. And I've had just a wonderful experience bringing my worldwide leadership experience in building organizations and developing and training people and growing things. And I brought those to Affirmation. I'm having just a wonderful time watching the work unfold around the world.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And if you could, for those who maybe aren't familiar with Affirmation, could one of you just kind of give a basic overview of what Affirmation is as an organization, its goals, its mission statement, etc.? Who'd like to do that?
Absolutely. I think Laurie Lee would be good at this. Laurie Lee sat on our governance committee, and she shepherded the new charter and bylaws through from where it had been sitting in committee for months and months and months, and brought it through all the way to completion. And so Laurie Lee really is the expert on governance in Affirmation.
So the charter that Nathan refers to harkens back to the formation of Affirmation some 42 years ago in 1977 in Provo, Utah. But the goals of Affirmation, the purposes remain much the same as they always were, but have been strengthened and include really the intersectionality of the LGBTQ experience and that of those with Mormon heritage or Mormon experience in some fashion. So that intersection of LGBTQ and something having to do with Mormonism, whether it's activity in the church, whether it's former activity in the church, whether it's simply a cultural experience amongst Latter-day Saints. Affirmation is for all of those who have some intersection in that area. And we have many, particularly in our Latin American chapters, who have no background in the LDS church, but come to Affirmation because we understand the intersectionality of organized religion and LGBTQ experience. We believe that we represent the best combination in an organization of those who can support sexual orientation, gender identity, and anywhere along a faith spectrum, and the self-identification of each individual to be able to self-identify with regard to all three of those aspects. And within those three different elements of life, we all have a place and belong together, and we fellowship together, and we build community, and we strengthen and support each other, and we find ways forward, and we find ways to heal, and we find ways to provide safety.
Thank you for that. And I just want to remind my listeners, anybody who might be listening, that please, feel free to make a comment on the thread of the Mormon Mental Health podcast. I know I'm also sharing this on my live Facebook feed, but it's easier for me to keep track on the actual podcast page. So if you can watch through the Mormon Mental Health page, if you want to make a comment or question to our guests tonight. So want to make this as interactive as possible. So I'm going to put you both on the spot maybe a little bit before I start asking the questions I really wanted to ask you both, because having this be a mental health podcast, I would maybe like to hear from your perspective instead of from, is my clinical perspective, what your thoughts are if you were to, reach out to our audience as far as what are good mental health practices of communities and organizations and churches that support LGBTQ plus folks and their families. How would you kind of give a general idea of what that might look like before we even start talking about how this manifests itself in kind of our LDS / Mormon culture / policies, doctrines, et cetera?
Great. I have a basic set of just 4 ideals that I look for when I'm looking for a supportive community, as well as when I'm building a supportive community, which we're doing as an executive committee in Affirmation. And the 4, they're simple. I mean, the first one is we have to have a community where you can name what is hurting you and what is wounding you. You can't let that hide. You can't be hidden. You have to be able to speak that, because that is part of your path to healing. And then secondly, you have to feel safe to be able to name either your beliefs or your non-beliefs. Spirituality is so, I believe, important, and it's very personal. And how we choose to express that, if we can do that in a safe manner, it is very helpful for all of our mental health. And then third, this community, we have to be able to do so in a supportive way, in a civil way, because the last thing you need is to be part of a community that raises your blood pressure all the time. I mean, that defeats being part of a community. And then the fourth thing that I look for, that I build is does your community allow for you to be happy right now, and not some distant time in the future, not later or after you die? Does your community support your happiness right now, this very minute? And so just those 4 simple ideals are what I look for in a supportive community, and what I am desperately and eagerly trying to build in Affirmation.
Thank you. That was a wonderful, comprehensive list. Laurie Lee, is there anything that you'd want to add to that, or we can just move on to the other questions?
Just to reinforce that when it comes to community building and sensitivity of the needs of our members, Nathan is not only the president, but he is among the most full of heart and love for our members.
Thank you. I've definitely felt that from so many people at Affirmation, including Nathan. Okay, so let's go back in time a little bit. So November 5th, 2015, we have this policy kind of leak that happens where it comes to everybody's attention that the church is kind of moving towards some policy changes, or whatever you want to call them, in regards to, in particular, people who find themselves in same-sex marriages, and also their children, and how they're going to be treated if you have children from anybody who is gay or in a same-sex marriage. So if you can kind of talk about this both from maybe your own personal perspective, like what was it like for you personally when that happened? but then also maybe think about what did you see ripple through the community that you're a part of. And given kind of how we started this whole thing, which is here's what good communities feel like and look like and should be about, what were some of the implications then for our community that doesn't necessarily meet all of those criteria?
I'm going to take a crack at that first, Laurie Lee.
Sure.
Good. I will be completely honest. November the 5th, 2015 was the darkest day in my experience that I've ever had with the church. When I first heard the rumor on Facebook, I'm like, yeah, that can't be true. That's not my church. It sounds nothing like my church. But then as the day rolled on and I discovered that this indeed was true, and the way that the policy was originally written, it was comprehensive for all children. And so all of a sudden I felt that my children were in the crosshairs of this policy, and they were innocent, they were faithful, they're believing, they were wanting to serve missions, advance in the priesthood. And this policy supplied none of that unless I didn't marry again. And my youngest, at the time I had at least 10 or 12 years before he was 18. And so I thought that's a long, long time. And I was angry at how this put my children in the crosshairs. And so I think at that point, I'm a dentist, and I rely on the public's, how they think of me, to come in. And I'm like, I could care less what the public thinks. I have to speak out on this. This is wrong for my kids. They need a voice. They can't speak for themselves. So I talked with Brady McCombs at Associated Press. My viewpoints on how horrible this went across the nation. I mean, for months I had patients come in and say, hey, I saw your article. I did TV interviews. I said, this is wrong for our children. And it was a stressful week. And then by the end of the week, there was a policy revision at that time that specifically said that children who were in my kids' position were not going to be affected. It was only if you hadn't been baptized yet. And so, for one moment, I'm like, wow, my kids aren't affected, but the policy is still in force. And so I was, over my head laid the big scarlet letter A of apostasy. If I ever marry again, and my stake president was sure to come over to my home and sit in my living room on my couch and tell me, if you ever marry again, I will excommunicate you. And so, and that was right after. So for 3.5 years, this was on my mind. And I kept saying, what's going to happen if this happens? And I was prepared for the long haul. And it was terrible. And I would constantly write on a blog that I was a perma blogger on, out of obscurity, just my feelings about how it felt to live under the oppression of the policy at the time. And I started to feel like people were starting to forget me. I mean, I felt like I was a refugee, and people of the church, and people were forgetting about people like me. And as time was going on, I'm like, is this the end game? So people will just forget about people like me, and hopefully just all the gays will leave the church, and that's it. So, it was a very dark time leading up to April the 4th of this year.
Well, and just to make a few points before I turn the time over to Laurie Lee, you're absolutely right. It qualified all children at first. And then one of the revisions was, well, now only children who live with the primary custody or joint custody or more, then they were affected, which in my practice, it affected several lesbian couples that were the primary, custodial parents of their children. So some of my gay members, it didn't affect them as much because they weren't the primary custodial parent, even though they still had visitation and some custodial, relationship with their children. And yeah, so I just want to make sure that people understand that it was all children, and then it turned into a custody issue, which, by the way, then started having implications on custody battles of people divorcing and having, kind of in mixed orientation marriages and all of that. So I just want to kind of lay some of the ground of what was happening.
I personally know men that were brought back to court for custody issues because of this very issue. It was messy and it was ugly. I mean, divorce is ugly anyway, but then to get called back in to fight over this because of a policy, it's just inhumane.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Laurie Lee, what about your experience in 2015? Oh, and I have you muted. I'm so sorry. Let me unmute you. There you go.
It's always good to have a voice.
We don't want to mute anybody here on Mormon Mental Health. Goodness grief.
There's enough of that going on in other circles.
That's right.
And of course, my experience was very different from Nathan's. Nathan's profound and very classic, in the middle of the circumstances experience, and he handled with such grace and such courage. In my case, I felt crippled by the news because, I've long learned that just because it may not directly apply to me, it applies to my community, it applies to my fellows. And I recognized from the beginning the enormous amount of damage that this was going to cause. But I also internalized it, and I sat with my wife at the time and talked through how could this possibly have occurred. And at that time, I was very close to considering living full time. And she asked me, do you think this includes us as well? And so I actually took the time within the next couple of days to write a letter to my stake president and say, President, you understand my situation. You understand that my marriage is going to look like a same-sex couple in the next several months. And how are you going to act in relationship to what's just been announced? How is this going to affect us? And he at the time said, I don't know. I don't know what this means for a transgender spouse and a straight spouse. And so that just kind of stayed under the radar for a while. Having, at the time, of course, I was working at church headquarters. I was very close in my association with senior brethren. When I watched the first version come out, and then a week later, if I'm remembering correctly, this modified version that we've just talked about come out, I recognize how policy is created in the church, how it's reviewed in committees, and how it's written, and how sometimes it can be rethought and adjusted and rewritten and released and then re-released. And we know it was released in the first case in a leaking kind of way, so it really wasn't prepared when it came out. I watched all that with incredible scrutiny, if you will, personal scrutiny from within the halls of the building. And I watched as my friend Michael Otterson attempted to interview Elder Todd Christofferson, and the whole debacle of trying to explain what that was in some terms that people could stomach, and realizing that it was a very, very difficult effort for them to try to salvage what they had already kind of let loose, and how uncomfortable that was for them, and how terrible it was making it for so many other people. And for me, the thing that broke my confidence was the statement made by President Nelson 2 months later in January of 2016, where he explained it as a revelation. And that revelatory process that he described to the young single adults across the church. And I looked at that and I said, based on what I've watched happen, that did not happen that way. And to me, that broke my confidence in that process, in those people. And I had to carry that. And it was a difficult burden for me to carry because it moved my feelings in a huge way.
Yes, for sure. That was a big critique, I think, through a lot of people, is that really felt like a flat out lie, that there had been some kind of revelatory process when there was knowledge that certain apostles had been out of town when this came out, and the revelatory process and in the Mormon church is very much about unanimity. Everybody's unanimous, everybody is on the same page, and that's not how this happened. And so
I had always been taught in my leadership roles in the church over 3 decades that the safety in the church was the unanimity of the quorum.
Right.
And nothing moved forward until that occurred. And it was evident that that did not exist here, which, certainly was plenty of reassurance to me that they had stepped in a wrong direction. And so many people were going to be hurt. By that time, we were already counting the daily suicides that were taking place in January of 2016. The horror that was coming out of this huge error was just incredible. It was unthinkable that this was happening to my church.
So let's move into that space where, you've both shared a lot of, how this personally affected you, but you're also a part of this larger community. You're, networked in with other people. You're hearing stories. I know I was hearing stories as well. Can we talk a little bit about the ramifications that this did have on the mental, emotional, and relational health of so many people affected?
Well, I think that beginning November the 5th, 2015, LGBTQ realized that they were part of a rejecting community. And this was hard. I know that there are many who have let's trust the brethren know, and I give them their space to do that. But I noticed a big sea change just in how I saw people interacting now with their church, and it was behavior that we would expect, rejecting behavior, people depressed, people thinking of suicide, people feeling alienated from their own families, people just abandoning their testimony and resigning because they didn't want to wait for a court or wait for something to happen. It really moved our entire community into a different mind space, because I will be honest, when I went to the Affirmation conference in September of 2015, right before the policy dropped, it was one of the most glorious conferences I have ever been to. It was so positive. It was so upbeat. The whole thoughts were, we are moving towards some reconciliation, some acceptance. I mean, the mood was highly positive.
Can you talk about some of the few maybe feels that felt like positive? I mean, there was like the website that was going up. Like, can you talk about maybe why the community was optimistic at that point?
Yeah, the website was going up. There started to be dialogue, with the church between Affirmation. If you read Greg Prince's book, you'll hear about the connections that Affirmation started making. They were wonderful. And just because of that, the mood was showing us that, hey, something is happening. We know that the civil rights movement, the new civil rights movement is moving, and maybe we're moving along with it. And so it was a time where we had a lot of hope. And then November 5th happened. And, the next year we had our conference, and I have two friends that are very good allies, and they had come to the November 15th or the September 15th, 2015 conference, expressed that same thing. And then they came with me to the next one the next year, and they said it was totally different. It was sadder. It was more of a people oppressed. And so that's the change that I saw just in mood in general.
So first of all, there's some comments on the thread. So Tony Hughes says, amen. So thanks for watching, Tony. I'm not sure exactly what she's amening, but something we've said resonated. And Jennifer Pearson says, yes, there was hope at Affirmation conference that year. So somebody who was also present who can witness to that. One of the things that Laurie Lee, you mentioned is, you started counting suicides. And this is something I express a lot. I know personal people who were tracking the suicides and tracking suicide death is difficult because not always is there, the family sometimes doesn't want to disclose that it was a suicide. Sometimes you're not sure why the suicide happened, right? There's not maybe a note left or things like that. And so there's been a lot of pushback on the numbers that, those from Affirmation and Mama Dragons and these organizations that were kind of keeping tabs of people they knew personally affected by suicide. There's been a lot of pushback saying, well, those numbers can't be, basically saying that's bunk. That's not true news. It's false news per se, right? So can we talk a little bit about what that's like to have the community kind of say, no, you guys are making a big deal out of nothing. That's not really happening. When we in the trenches kind of know people personally affected, tragically at the most tragic level by suicide, but then also by other things like clinical depression, anxiety attacks, all kinds of mental health symptoms.
It doesn't take very long when you start to be able to recite in your mind the names and see the faces of those affected to know that the numbers in that case were real, because they were real people. Good gosh, we look at the victims of the Holocaust and we know their names. We look at the victims of 9/11 and we remember their names. We look at those who died at Vietnam, and the monument carries every single one of their names. Well, in this case, our community was tracking and knew the names of those who were lost, and we knew the names of those who were damaged and those who were traumatized. And we were them, and we knew them, and we count them. And as Nathan has said, often we give them voice where they can have voice, and we tell their stories where they have no more voice.
And what would you say to the naysayers that say, well, you can't know that it was the policy that did this?
Well, the naysayers often won't hear anyway. I think what we need to focus on is our constituency, on our people, on the fact that we know that the conditions in the community have been very adverse, that families were being divided by the policy, that church members were being set against members of the church and LGBTQ community. If those things are happening, if adverse things are happening, then that's wrong. It really doesn't matter if I can prove one person or another. The damage is visible and it's being done, and we know who they are. Stop and listen to their stories. Take time with them like we have, and we know.
And I thank you, Laurie Lee. I want to build on that and what Natasha said. For years, as a community, we have been giving our anecdotal stories of how we have been feeling, the things that we saw as the community that was living under these conditions. But oftentimes people would say, well, you can't prove it. You have no idea. What Greg Prince's book is it gave validation to our shared experience. And I can read that and I can say, yep, that is us. This is a second witness. Greg Prince's book is a second witness to our voices that we have been raising. And I am very, very grateful that we have something that is so scientifically sound, that shows exactly what happened, so that we can feel some validation, some affirmation to the things that we have experienced as a community. That in and of itself is healing.
Well, and I will just add my clinical backing on this. And we know a lot of this through projects like the Family Acceptance Project and other researchers. There's best practice and very clear research that shows that rejecting behaviors do actually correlate with risk of suicide and mental health symptoms. So this is not just coming out of the air, and it's been studies that have come out of several, bodies of work. And in fact, we know that gay, lesbian, and bisexual people are at 3 to 5 times higher risk of suicide. And we know that transgender folks are 8 to 10 times higher risk of suicide, especially in communities that are considered rejecting, and the rejecting behaviors, which are listed, especially in the Family Acceptance Project pamphlet. If everybody wants to go look at that, it has a really nice list of what the example of rejecting versus accepting behaviors, which, by the way, you don't have to change your values or your beliefs to necessarily be on either one of those lists. So that's interesting. But this policy was definitely a rejecting behavior, being very prominent and public and aggressive. about disciplining people who aren't necessarily living a lifestyle in a way that, I just want to point out again, plenty of people in the Mormon church sin, if you want to call it sin. There's lots of different kinds of sins, right? And so whether or not you agree that homosexual or transgender behavior is a sin, other sinners are not treated in this rejecting way to the level that this was being, kind of produced in, in the leadership circles and so forth. So I just want to back that, your anecdotal stuff with some clinical research that it exactly mirrors what you're saying.
In Affirmation, we understand that, and we have an extremely strong suicide prevention program. It's the QPR program, and we consistently teach suicide prevention at every conference, every retreat that we have, and without fail, within the first few hours of the participants becoming suicide aware and how to prevent it, people are saving lives. This is hard facts, and then we go about our daily business in our community, saving lives. Just today, I was doing QPR with somebody. And this is a common occurrence where we're taking care of our own because of rejecting behaviors that are prevalent in the community.
Laurie Lee, did you want to say something about that? I think you were leaning in.
Leaning in just because I think Nathan was making such a profound point. For the past year and a half, Affirmation has been working very hard at training, not just here locally, but across all of our chapters in Central and South America as well. Suicide awareness and prevention techniques, so that as a community, our leaders and our members are all aware and can catch those and can embrace them when they are in a situation where they need some support.
Thank you. Okay. We got another comment here again from Jennifer Pearson. My shelf broke after the policy. I couldn't go to church anymore. I knew this policy was not from God whatsoever. Having a gay son is a blessing. I will never be the same. This isn't the church I grew up in. I've lost my community and I've lost my friends. Thank you, Jennifer, for that vulnerability. That's, I think, a very common scenario and feeling from how many people, not just, LGBTQ plus individuals themselves, but their families, their loved ones, seeing how this affected people that are in their inner circles. It's a very kind of, there's immediate trauma or direct trauma to the individual. And then there's visceral trauma, right? That happens to the people that you love when they're watching you hurt or watching you be disciplined or watching you be rejected by the community that you're a part of. It's incredibly harmful and sad for so many people. So thank you, Jennifer, for that. So let's move into, so just a few days ago, wham, bam, boom, reversal of the policy. So all is well, right? And I hate to be blithe about that. Sometimes I use humor inappropriately, so forgive me. But why, I think for some, first of all, there's a wide variety of spectrum of responses to this. And for some, celebration was a part of it, right? Because I think that, oh my goodness, we actually made a change, and this is definitely a change in the right direction versus the wrong direction. But it's much more complex than that. But I think what I really want to get at is, I think for those who aren't as affected by this and who are members of the church, they might be more blithe about it in the sense of like, well, see, it's fine now. What's the big deal? This is, why is everybody still upset? And kind of this idea that you're going to, those of you who are upset are choosing to be upset, or all you want to do is be upset. You're upset if we do the policy, you're upset if we don't do the policy, right? Kind of missing a whole lot of complexity that has to do with trauma. So I'm just going to open up kind of your perspectives about what was it like to hear about the policy change, and what have been some of the responses that you yourselves have had or those in the community have had to that.
Well,
it's heavy, right?
It's heavy because 2 weeks before the policy reversal, my stake president and bishop were sitting in my living room again, and we talked about all the wonderful things that Affirmation is doing, from suicide prevention to providing community, to being a life-saving organization, and really being there at the intersection of LGBTQ and the church. And it was a wonderful conversation. But for the hour that we had, the stake president kept looking at my engagement ring over and over and over again. And after an hour, he couldn't stop himself. He just had to say, Brother Kitchen, is there been a change in your relationship status? And I said, no, I'm engaged. I'm not married yet. Don't worry. Because he's worried about having to excommunicate me. And he just looked at me and he said, after all of this wonderful experience, he said, I hope you don't take it personally when I have to excommunicate you. And that's when I realized that.
How can you not take that personally? Oh my goodness.
I was dumbfounded that do we really, is this really happening? I mean, this is my ceiling to my kids. This is, personal, family, my family. And to have that said, it was incredible to me. And so I was just, I was like dark for the next week. And then all of a sudden the policy reversal happens. And I'm like, what in the world is going on here? And I think that, I was confused. I think many were confused. And I started to see people needing to be able to speak about what this meant to them. And I wanted to be sure that no organization, not even Affirmation, would hide the stories that people needed to tell. There's not one correlated story to this, and people run the entire gamut. If you go look at our story sharing site, we have 30 plus stories right now, and they range from hopefulness to very charitable ideas on why this was, to people that were very harmed and hurt and had some angry things to say. But all of our personal stories, our personal story and how we're feeling should not trigger anybody. We need to feel like we can be able to speak our truth and say it and have a platform. And I'm like, I want to give Affirmation's extensive social network platform to get the word out so that people can begin talking, people can begin healing. And as a community, we can decide, okay, let's sit with this. What are we going to do? Where are we going to go from here? And Laurie Lee at one of our executive committee meetings said something so wise. I wrote it down. She said, people think that with this reversal of the policy that we just go back to November the 5th, 2015 ways. And she said, it's impossible to ever return to November the 5th, 2015. We have traveled through 3.5 years of things that have changed us. And we are in no way, we're in no way back to November the 5th, 2015. So I wanted to give voice and have people tell their stories on how they lived and what had happened to them during the policy.
Laurie Lee, your thoughts on the impact of the reversal?
Well, I had a good friend, I think we've heard his interview as well, where he spoke about it being very much like ripping a very large scab off. And just the pain of having those wounds reopened. I think for many that became very apparent to me. I think Nathan was extremely inspired to recognize the need to invite everyone to share their stories with Affirmation, and that we continue to see every few hours a new story being posted on our story site, and it's a hard but worthy read to go through those. And I would recommend that for anyone who's participating in the podcast tonight.
And I'll make sure and link to that.
That would be wonderful. Thank you. The profound feelings all over the map of what this means to people, which, I have not a charitable look at what's happened here and see the intentional institutional abuse that's occurred. And what Nathan said was correct. I've reflected on it repeatedly. Major traumatic events in history are similar to how I feel towards these 3.5 years. I wrote on my own personal post, 1,245 days, that we will never go back to being the same as before. And it was an institution responsible for our spiritual welfare and well-being and the care of us as individuals and as families that inflicted intentionally this kind of abuse upon their people, and then to just simply take it away and acknowledge that we hope this will make things easier for families, is, in my mind, is just continues the horror, continues the institutional abuse.
So let's talk about that for a minute, because, you know, it's not uncommon for humans to hurt each other. And I've done a lot of training and trauma work. And we know, again, through best care practices, that when possible, if possible, when an apology or the tone, you know, is reparative, that although, again, it doesn't just magically wipe all the pain away, it is part of a healing equation, right? You're more apt to be in more fertile territory for healing than when there aren't those kinds of things forthcoming. Healing can still happen, but it's a little easier when the perpetrator, per se, can take responsibility, can have a, you know, humble and contrite spirit. I mean, we use these words in Mormonism, right? And when that kind of is a balm of Gilead, per se, for the person who's been hurt. So can you talk a little bit about what you have felt the tone to be like so far? There was no apology. There was one possible slight sentence that maybe implicated that they understood this had been hard for families, but very, very small kind of reference to that. And you really had to look for it and know the language to even know that it was there. So can you talk a little bit about that, about tone and apologies and your take on what I'm saying?
Nathan, is it okay if I keep on?
Oh, please. I love your point of view, Laurie Lee.
Using terminology that the church taught me, the first step is to recognize that you've done something wrong and to acknowledge that. And that has not happened. A good friend of ours, John Bonner, who's a member of Affirmations board, wrote an incredible post the other day of what could have been said. And I could never say it better than how John wrote that. So that's worthy of linking to this as well. If we want to see what could have been said and been so much more powerful and healing and helpful, at least steps towards healing the great chasm that's been created.
Was that on his Facebook page that he posted
that? Was on his Facebook page, yes.
Thank you.
You can find John there. And I tip my hat to him for how well he said what really should have been said. In lieu of that, for those of us who still wish to engage in elements of the gospel of Jesus Christ, we may have been abandoned by our church, but we haven't been abandoned by our God. And I feel deep concern for those who have lost their confidence in God because they've lost their confidence in the church. Because I personally believe and experience that my relationship with God continues to deepen and strengthen as these things are experienced, and that through those things that I know and love and feel and believe, that's where I can find a large measure of my healing, through my relationship with God and through the blessing of being able to associate with like-minded people. And so one thing that I would suggest is recognize that the church is not the God. We don't worship the church. Please, let's not us put our stock, our faith in our spiritual authority in the institution alone that does these kinds of things. I think Gina Colvin wrote this very well the other day on her Facebook site, that the institution should never be the recipient of our worship or of our spiritual authority. We shouldn't hand our lives over to that institution. But unfortunately, for many of us, we were vulnerable to that, and the institution did what they did. And so we've each got to then find our way forward, because it's evident that they're not going to do the things necessary to bridge the gap to come to us. And so for individuals who wish to bridge the gap and build that bridge back to Mormonism, I would walk with them and I would sit with them but there are so many others who unfortunately have lost that connection to what they had. And it's not going to come back for them. I feel for them.
My gosh, that is so powerful, Laurie Lee. I think we are in an era, and we were just told this in conference last year, that we're in a home-centered, church-supported era. And I am seeing that families in this home-centeredness are less and less willing nowadays to leave their children behind, to leave their siblings behind. And the best that we can do just as a community is to support these homes and to have these homes be very inclusive and to light the way to say, hey, society works and society is okay because look at us. We're not leaving anyone behind. We are all going together as a family because we believe that families are so strong and important. I mean, the church does not have a monopoly on family. And by doing this and by having these, what I would call points of light across the Wasatch Front, across the United States, across the world, that families will lead the way of inclusiveness and the church will do what they will do. And they will support homes. They will support families.
So we have Fabian saying saludos. So saludos, Fabian. And then we have Emerald making a comment here that's somewhat long, but I'm going to read it. He says, I'm not a member anymore, but even as someone just looking now at people trying to lead others, I was so disappointed. Even the best, most congratulatory responses to the policy change, even if a person is super believing or truly thinks this is awesome progress, there's just no defending how it was delivered and is continuing to be brushed aside. Reading about it in a news article, not acceptable. Not even so much as a one line of we understand that there are many details to follow up with and we plan on doing so. They can have firesides for youth, for young couples, for parents, but no fireside for LGBTQ to increase understanding of a very confusing situation. It's just proof that this change is for those not actually directly affected by it. And then Christina Strong says, thank you for sharing. My heart understands, and I'm glad to better understand you. Thank you, Christina, for that thought. As you bring up families, Nathan, I'm sorry, but that just kind of triggers me a little bit. And I'm not even LGBTQ, and I'm still triggered. So I apologize for using maybe that word. But we did get some direction on families. And actually, it was a very different message this Sunday at General Conference. It wasn't that we all gather each other around and leave nobody behind. The message was really more about, we are going to leave lots of people behind because unless you're on the Mormon train in a very specified, direct way, which was very actually different than what I've heard the doctrine explained before. When you think about our history and Joseph Smith and, thinking of his dead brother. And I'm guessing that's why he had a lot of these thoughts about, those are kind of thoughts I hear here in evangelical Wichita. It's like, if you're not a believer, sorry, you're out, too bad, so sad. And that's what Joseph Smith was, I'm guessing, experiencing as well in his time and age. And so I always felt like our ideas about the ever after and families being together and baptism for the dead, and it's kind of like this idea that, we don't totally understand where everybody's at. And unless you've seen Jesus Christ in the face and know that you are absolutely denying him, there's still hope. And I always thought it was a very hopeful Mormon family message, like we'll see who gets to the other side and it's not for us to decide. And that was very different this time around with our prophet's words about, no, if you even have a slight opportunity to not even really understand, but if you reject us at all, even if you're a good member, he talked, even if you're a good person, a good community member, that's not enough. Sorry, so sad, too bad. And I was like, wow, when did we become evangelical Christian in Mormonism? So I guess that's my rage at a time when, like Emerald says, they really should be reaching out to LGBT community. That was his message. I know a lot of people were hoping to hear something healing, something inclusive, something that would help, kind of heal or give comfort to the many people who were kind of reeling from this policy change. And that was the choice that he made of a delivery. So any response from that? Anybody want to join my rage train?
I'm glad that God is the judge.
Yes, he said that too. And I was like, amen. I was like, amen, prophet.
I think that our community is a community inadvertently that is driving, such ideas and strong positions. And for me, it's not up to me to decide doctrine. I don't decide doctrine. The brethren will do that. But what I can control is me right now in this life, my happiness, and the people that I have around me. And I want to be in a community that helps me be the very best that I can, that is so awesome that no one can ignore it, that it's the place to be. Affirmation is the new, this is the place. Let's build this community. Let everyone else figure out about the doctrine, because it is going to happen. I mean, we know it's going to happen. We've seen the church go through polygamy and blacks in the priesthood, and we know something's going to happen. And I'm not going to wait, for my grandchildren to enjoy an inclusive church. I'm going to enjoy things right this very minute.
So you're really talking about this approach of building your own kind of Zion in the space that you're planted. And for you, that's working.
What else do we do? I mean,
Yes.
We can sit around and stare at our navels and twiddle our thumbs and be reactive to every word. Or what do? I want to be proactive. Let's build something great, because I will tell you, you get a bunch of LGBTQ people in a room within 5 minutes. We are absolutely in love with each other. We are best friends. All of our shared experiences come out, and we can talk for hours. And this, let's do that. Let's get together. Let's be that community for each other.
Laurie Lee, any thoughts about the messages around family or general conference in general, as far as things or addressing the LGBTQ community after this reversal?
Well, one of the things that Nathan and I have been talking about these past few days comes down to what I described as affirmation, what's next. There is definitely a what's next. And that what's next is largely what Nathan has just described. It's the antithesis, it's the alternative, it's the solution to everything you just raged about, Natasha. All of the exclusion, all of the leaving of members behind, all of whatever that kind of stuff that might get dished out and then magnified by the time it ripples down to local talks in sacrament meeting. All of that can be counteracted by what Nathan has described. Affirmation, what's next, is we will be that community. We will be that space. We will welcome folks in, be they allies, be they LGBTQ, be they in the church or out of the church, or having really never had a whole lot to do with the church. Our desire is to build a community of people. And one of the things that Nathan has taught that I think is so beautiful is that we have had a tendency in the past several years, as we've become an online people, to kind of fracture into our own little Facebook groups, our own little affinity groups. We get into echo chambers where we talk to the same people that are just like us, that have our same story, except for when we come together face to face. And then we bring diversity together and we start to learn how to become an inclusive people who are willing to talk with people with different stories and different experiences. And we do experience that love inside of 5 minutes that occurs as we really get to know people and hear where they're coming from and what their experience is. And I think for some of us, that's what we used to find when we come together with fellow ward members in church meetings. And yet now, I think where we can find that, particularly for those of us that have been marginalized, or like myself, just simply put out, because I did get the big red A stuck on my forehead, and I know what it means to be put out of the church that I helped build. To be able to come into community and to feel that love and to feel that full fellowship again, when that fellowship was ripped away from me, is a beautiful and profound thing.
And Laurie Lee, it was literally the church that you built. That was
yes.
beautiful.
Yes. Well, and that really speaks, I really appreciate your emotion and your vulnerability, Laurie Lee, because I think that really speaks to how a lot of people feel. I think sometimes, especially people who maybe don't belong to our community or maybe have left the community, would say things like, well, why do you belong to such a church? Or why do you want to stay involved with such a church that would reject you as such? And yet, or even people within might say, well, if you don't like it, why don't you just leave? It's very hard to leave a family, right? Or a system or an identity, or even for many still very believing members. You know, there's many LGBTQ plus members who really have testimonies, and it's a huge part of their spiritual journey is to be a member of our church. And so it's really heartbreaking to me when, like you're saying, you strive to be a part of the community, you strive to serve the community, you've given money to the community, you've done multiple sacrifices for the community, you've raised maybe your children in the community, your children are part of the system as well. And people just say, well, why don't you just leave? Or, it just seems so minimizing of the complexity of this whole thing. If you want to, Affirmation came out with a position statement after the reversal. So as board members, do you want to talk a little bit about how you formulated that and what the position statement says? I've linked to that as well here on the Facebook page.
It was a very cool process. In Affirmation, we have created a rapid response team because we realize when an organization gets so big that no one can wait, 24, 48 hours for a statement to come out of a 15-member board. And so we have created a rapid response system. And I woke up at 6 a.m. and I was getting messages that something as big is happening at 9. And so we didn't know what it was, but we knew that we were to be ready. So we activated the rapid response system. And there were 3 people that were part of that, Laurie Lee, myself, and John Gustav Rathall. And I remember I was with a patient, and I got to a place where I could stop, and it was 8:59, and I'm on the computer and I'm just refreshing the page, refreshing it. And it pops up at 9 and I read it and I immediately start weeping, realizing what kind of an effect this is going to have on our community. And immediately within 30 minutes, we were calibrating each other on what needs to be said. And, all 3 of us have been around the block in Affirmation, and we know a community. We know the things that need to be said because we know the feelings that are happening. And Laurie Lee was just awesome enough to take first pass on this statement, got it up, and we were busily editing a Google Doc in real time. I mean, I would edit, and then I would see people, we were on the 3 corners of the continental United States editing a document in real time. And under 2 hours, we had a statement out that really reflected both not only Affirmation's point of view, but I think it fully represented every member in Affirmation, LGBTQ.
Do you want to talk about the main points that position statement made?
Maybe, Nathan, you'll let me try my hand at that?
Yes.
I would offer to, first of all, to flesh out perhaps Nathan's explanation of how that occurred. It was a sacrifice to be on that rapid response team, because rather than step back and kind of process and heal, we 3, and Nathan was at work at the time, we 3 had to immediately start processing, what does this mean for our larger community? What does this mean in the context of the last 3.5 years? And what does it mean in terms of what was said by the church versus what wasn't said by the church, versus what we need to say in terms of how to strengthen the feelings within our community of you're supported, you're recognized, you're visible to us, you're loved by us. And so we did what we have done many times with our recent statements that we've issued. We've issued several since this rapid response team got put into place about a year ago. We focused on those things which our community needed to hear. One of those things that the statement contains, which means the most to me, is that there still is nothing with regard to the plight of the transgender member.
Mhm.
Nothing in the policy in the first place affected us really directly, but to this date, the transgender member still does not know where they stand in the church, and are treated in extremely different ways in different parts of the church.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, one of the main points we had to make is that given the fact that those in same-sex marriages and same-sex relationships are still in the specter of serious transgression, there are a lot of individuals in and not in relationships who really don't know yet where they stand in the church. And we needed to speak to that. There's still yet a lot of unknowns. A couple of good things happened. Children can receive ordinances. That's a wonderful thing. We applaud that. The direct and immediate stigmatizing of apostasy upon same-sex legally married couples has been lifted. That's great. Good move. Shouldn't have done it in the first place.
Yeah.
However, here we are. But there's still so many unanswered questions. And yet, I think our view is always one of trying to be hopeful going forward, hopeful towards our community, that yes, there is yet a lot of work to be done. We have so much to do still going forward, and we are there and we are committed to being a part of that work going forward amongst our members, and also intra-community with other organizations and as the church, as well as they're willing to heal and to find a forward path for all of our members to be safe and to worship if they choose to.
So Emerald says, actively engaged in a good cause, right on, heart. Christina Strong says, yes, love my LGBTQ plus peeps. You got to be in line with current culture to understand peeps. And then I've got Christina Strong saying, count me in, love your heart and soul, Laura Lee. That was shared when you were sharing some of your personal emotion about some of the things that you were talking about. And just, I can really appreciate having this rapid response team, because I'm part of the Mormon Mental Health Association, a small organization of clinical therapists and educators and coaches that care about, culturally competent care being given to the LDS population. We do not have a rapid response team, so we were scrambling to come up with something. And so I just want to let you know, as leaders of Affirmation, that you have a position statement from the Mormon Mental Health Association, mirroring a lot of your thoughts and our concerns from a clinical perspective. And we actually linked to your Affirmation page as part of that position statement. Oh, and also the Human Rights Campaign linked to your Affirmation position statement, I noticed. So that's a big deal. That's wonderful.
We wanted to be on the crest of the story, and we didn't want to come in hours later and just mop up.
Yes.
I think that we showed to our community that we are full players, and that anytime that there's a movement on the needle within the church on any issue, either just anything, that this is Affirmation's expertise. This is where we stand. And I was grateful that we could be in that position to get this out when we did. I thank Laurie Lee for helping do this.
Yeah, I agree. And John, whom I know fairly well, who's not on with us tonight, but thank you for that, all of you for that. I think that's very important. So I know we're kind of at the end of our time together. And so I thought I would give you kind of an invitation to talk to some possible entities, and not that you have to address all of them, but the ones that you'd like to address. If we could sit with the main church leadership, right? So the church headquartered type of leadership, what would we want them to understand about the situation from our lived experience? If we could sit with or reach out to local leadership, which I think is often very different. And I actually get quite a few bishops or even stake presidency members reaching out about an episode they've heard on Mormon Mental Health, and they find some of the concepts very helpful to them, or other ecclesiastical leaders like young men's and young women's leaders. There's so many people at a local level involved with LGBTQ plus members, Relief Society presidents, et cetera. And then maybe the population, that you are serving, so all the LGBTQ plus members within the church, either trying to make church work or needing to take a step back from church. So that's a lot. I guess we could do a whole podcast on just this one question I'm asking, but just what are your initial thoughts about maybe, reaching out to one of those communities, or you can say something to all three.
So if I could, your multifaceted question triggered a couple of thoughts. Even here where we live in Kentucky, we have reached out to the local coordinating council, which is the Area 70 and all of the stake presidents in this area, and made our Kentuckiana chapter available, of Affirmation available to those priesthood leaders whenever they have an interaction with a new LGBTQ person in their congregation, and they feel that they need support or help, or even just to answer any questions that they as leaders may have as to how to approach and handle the needs of that individual in a sensitive way. Our chapter, and I'm thinking that our chapters across the country in Affirmation, of which there are now over 30, can be a resource to local priesthood leaders that they need to be comfortable using and be aware of, that we are trained and understand our people and understand how to best minister in many cases to our people in sensitive ways. I hope that we can do much more of that. One of the comments that came up earlier tonight was that, people could ask and do ask me on occasion, why do I stay constructively engaged with the LDS Church when they excommunicated me and told me that I had no place with them and tried to erase me? I stay engaged in large measure because of those closeted LGBTQ Latter-day Saints who are still there behind us, who need a connection to our community and may not find it unless we stay connected. And my hope is that we can do more of that. I'd like to defer to Nathan to talk about what it means to talk eye to eye with the general authorities of the church. He's had some experience with that in this work, but I believe there's so much we can do at the ground roots and local church level, ward by ward.
Thank you, Laurie Lee. I totally agree with that. And just for those who are listening too, the Family Acceptance Project, which I will also link to, has a free downloadable PDF file that is very helpful to help anybody in a ward setting. It's specifically written for LDS communities. So I'll make sure and link to that as well. That's a good resource, especially if you don't have maybe access. Do you have Affirmation branches available to any ecclesiastical leader in the United States? And if so, how do I get to that link?
The process is actually being put in place at this time. I mentioned over 30 chapters in the United States and Canada at this point, and several in other areas of the world. Our goal is to have chapters within a 2-hour drive, maybe handling 3 or 4 stakes back here in the East, or, within, regions of the Intermountain West. There is now a chapter, someone to talk to in every part of the United States and Canada at this time. And contacting our affirmation.org website, we can quickly, within 24 hours, put you in contact with someone in their local area who can talk things through with them.
Okay, and I found the page to that. It's a local chapters page, so I'll make sure and link to that as well. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, Nathan.
Oh my goodness, so many things to say. I mean, your questions we could fill.
I'm actually the worst question person, because I know I hear it as I say it. I just asked like 4 questions in one question, so I apologize.
No, the impressions that came to me while you were speaking is as Mormons, we as a people are really good at making LGBTQ kids. We just are. And
that's a great way to put that.
The messages that I would have for leaders and for people in our stakes and wards are, we are with you and we will always be with you. Even if you try to ignore us or confine us by policy or proclamation, we are here and we are existing. So we are not an others, and we're not a those people. So see us. And, just begin with just the basic humanity of how one would basically humanely treat a friend or a colleague who is LGBTQ. I mean, first thing, use proper pronouns. Be inclusive in your speech. Be aware that not everyone you speak to in Ward Branch Stake is straight. Make your messages so they're universally applicable to all of God's children. So I mean that would be one of the things that I would say. But
and I would say also straight or cisgender, just to clarify,
yes,
because
yes.
a lot of people really conflate those two, like, oh, it's all the same thing, and it's not at all. So orientation has to do with who you're attracted to, and gender identity is how you identify on the masculine feminine scale, which in of itself is problematic to begin with. So, I think there's a lot to learn, right, just about these terms. But I'm sorry to interrupt. Anytime I have a little chance to educate, I want to be able to do that.
Thank you for calling me out, because I appreciate people who are patient educators, because even though I have been doing this for years, I have so much to learn on how to be an ally to the transgender community. I was talking with Kimberly Anderson last year, and I spend sometimes a weekend on letters other than my own, just so that I can understand who is in my community and what are the issues. And so I think if I do that, let's put the work as the church community and do the same thing, and put the work in to understand all the letters and what are the things about all the letters that are important. So, I mean, that's what I would say. And then to my community, I would say, you have a place. You are not alone. And even if you ever feel alone, or you feel like there's no one is on your side, or you're questioning or what to do, Affirmation can hook you up very rapidly with people who understand what's happening. And you don't have to feel like you're doing this alone or being alone. I did alone, and I never want people to ever have to do that alone. And so I want people to know that not only do we have a community for you, to where within 5 minutes you just fall in love with everyone that is there, but I want you to know that we have an affirmation that stands strong, and it stands proud, and it stands tall, to be able to provide an institutional voice that you can lean in on at any time. Because once you question what happens, for instance, with church or any other organization where you have relied on part of your identity, you are searching for, another, where's my people that can validate me? And I want to just say that Affirmation stands proudly to validate who you are in your self-determination. Because I firmly believe that every single one of us in the community are reliable reporters of our own experience, and we can be trusted to be able to say how we're feeling and be trusted to make choices that are healthy and beneficial to us as individuals.
So I'll take on the leadership question then. As far as the main church, my thoughts would be that we have vast resources in our church. We're a very well-to-do financial organization, very stable. And I would highly encourage those at the highest levels of the church to really use those resources in behalf of this part of our community. I know, because I've spoken to many of these entities in person, and I've been invited to speak at conferences and so forth, that there are people in the Department of Health and Human Services in our government who would love the opportunity to come in and offer LGBTQ plus affirming training to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I also know that there's people who would love the opportunity to do that at the Human Rights Campaign. I know that there's people who would love to do that who are part of the Mormon Mental Health Association. I know that there's people who would love to do that who are part of the ASECT community, the American Association of Sexual Educators, Therapists, and Counselors. So, and those are just a few off the top of my head. I know that there are very qualified, research-based, respectful of faith communities who would love to have the opportunity to train or to give perspectives or to share research to the officials of the church. And I would highly recommend that that be done. I think it's actually unethical, and at this point, as we're understanding the risks, negligent if the church is not willing to step outside of their bubble and, network and collaborate with people who are not of our faith, who specialize in the mental health best care practices that we can give this population. So that's what I would say to the top 15 and anybody who works for them. I would love to give both of you the last word. So final thoughts, anything I haven't asked you that you hoped maybe I would, any thoughts that you have just in conclusion?
I love Laurie Lee's perspective. So if you would, Laurie Lee, you go last. I just want to invite any LGBTQ family or friends to our international conference that will happen in June in Provo at the Convention Center. And the dates are June the 21st, the 22nd, and the 23rd. And there you will be hearing Greg Prince will speak. You will hear us as an executive committee speak. We have other just awesome keynote speakers. We have workshops from the community. And it is my goal to return to a 2015 conference where it is optimistic and hopeful, not because we're relying on the church per se, but it's optimistic and hopeful because we're relying on each other as we build our loving and supportive communities one with another. And then, if that's not enough, I want to invite everyone who's LGBTQ to come to World Pride. Affirmation is having a regional conference the very next weekend. I know it's the weekend of Love Loud, but the very next weekend, June the 28th, 29th, and 30th, we will have a conference in New York City. And then on Sunday, for the first time ever, World Pride is being held in the United States, and it's in conjunction with the anniversary of Stonewall.
Oh, wow.
So this is a big event deal. We have our parade space. The parade, it's not a parade, it's a march. We have our march spot, and the march committee has put us in the first group, so we don't have to be marching around, late in the night. We're in the first one. We're front and center. And so I appreciate World Pride for doing that for Affirmation. We're going to carry our banners high. We're going to have t-shirts. This is going to be a very historic event. So mark this on your calendars. And if you're not going to be doing Love Loud this year, let the allies do Love Loud. Let's go and let's celebrate what happened at Stonewall. Let's celebrate what happened when transgender individuals helped break open the rights and the thoughts in our mind that we could be a self-determining people. Come and join with us, and it's going to be a very, very cool and historic weekend. So that's my thoughts, my last thoughts.
Thank you, Nathan. And you've been listening to the president of Affirmation. And I'll let Laurie Lee finish up.
So Natasha, thank you so much for giving us the time to talk tonight about this subject that is so incredibly important to us and to our community. Appreciate so much the work that you do and the Mormon Mental Health podcast is doing across so many different issues to benefit and bless us as a people. I guess my only parting thoughts is I look back over my own transition, my own coming out to myself personally, and my experiences going forward. I've always been a very optimistic person, and I think something of a resilient person. And I totally believe our people can be optimistic and resilient as well. I believe in our community. I believe that we can collectively go forward, and we can hold our heads up, and we can look others in the eye, and we are equals, and we deserve equality, we deserve visibility, and we deserve all the rights and privileges that any other person has available to them. And I believe we will continue forward until those are obtained. I believe that we will continue to work as an organization in Affirmation until all of our members are safe in whatever context, in their life choices, in their self-determination, and in their spirituality that they may determine for themselves and their families. I believe that these things can be, and I believe in us, and I believe in those who love and support us amongst our allies, who have enormous love and so much to give. And I'm grateful for them. I'm grateful for this opportunity to talk tonight.
I know you can't necessarily see this, Laurie Lee, but as you were talking, there was lots of hearts on Facebook Live, going up into the air. So that's a lot of love, I think, spent your way. And all I will say to that is amen. I completely agree with that. And you've been listening to the Senior Vice President of Affirmation and Laurie Lee Hall. Thank you for your comments about Mormon Mental Health podcasts. For any of you who are listening and find these kinds of programs valuable, we need your financial support to be a viable, sustainable presence. And I really feel passionate about this work. I hope I do it justice. And so if you could please spend some monies to send our way to continue this podcast, that would be very helpful. For those of you who already do that, thank you. And there are, I know that not everybody can financially support. There are non-financial ways you can support us. You can like our Facebook page. You can give us a positive review on Facebook or iTunes. You can share content with family and friends, ecclesiastical leaders that you're a part of knowing, so that they have more resources available to them. I think I believe in the Mormon people. I think we're wonderful people, mostly trying to do really great things. And as all people, oftentimes falling short because, after all, we are all human. Mirror a lot of Laurie Lee thoughts that I think we're a resilient people. We're able to rise strong and heal from things where we've really unfortunately wounded each other along the way. So with that vein, thank you so much, both of you, for joining me tonight. I really respect your time and your energy, and I know you're busy in your own lives. So thank you so much for serving in your communities the way you are, and for making Affirmation such a wonderful place. I've been to your conferences, and it's just a lovely presence to be around. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Unknown ways before me roll. Hiding rock and treacherous show. Chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
As a mother stills her child, thou canst hush
boisterous way,
boisterous way.
obey thy will.
Obey thy will.
When thou sayest
sayest
to them,
Be still.
wondrous sovereign of the sea, Jesus, Savior, pilot me. When at last I near the shore, and the fearful breakers roar, may I hear thee say to me, fear not, I will pilot
Thee.
twixt me and
Twixt me and
the peaceful rest.
the peaceful rest.
Then while leaning on my breast, may I hear thee say to me, fear not,